But again, welcome to those who are present in person here and those who have logged in online. Welcome to the very first seminar of the series that we are calling as the CIB Presidential Seminar Series that is being broadcast from Purdue University. And as you all know, this semester, the focus of the series is going to be on women researchers in the construction industry. And so starting off this series is we have pleasure of having Professor Rana Khallaf from Future University in Egypt. So let me read a brief bio, just so that you all know. So Dr. Rana Khallaf is an associate professor in the Structural Engineering and Construction Management Department at Future University in Egypt, where she has been working for the past 6 years. She obtained her PhD from Purdue University in Construction Engineering and Management and taught there as a lecturer before moving back to Egypt. She's a seasoned expert with over 13 years of experience in construction project management, consulting, teaching, and research. Currently, Dr. Rana's areas of interest include public-private partnership, management of renewable energy projects, interactional analysis, digital twins, AI applications in construction, and lean construction. She was awarded a 2-year fund by the Science and Technology Development Fund in Egypt to study financial assessment and value for money analysis of renewable energy PPP projects. This research has led to several publications and won a Best Paper Award at the Euromed Science Conference in Leipzig, Germany in 2022. Dr. Rana is active in the research front and has published numerous conference and journal papers. She also develops training material and professional courses for AEC industry and was an instructor for USAID-funded project. Prior to her PhD, Dr. Rana founded a project management consultancy office that served US-based projects in areas of scheduling, cost control, and delay analysis. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Rana Khallaf.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Professor Hassak, for this warm welcome. And thank you, everyone who's joining us live, joining us online. It's a pleasure to be back here at Purdue. So today I'm going to be talking about something that's near and dear to me, and that is the topic of one of my funded projects, which is a financial and value for money analysis for renewable energy projects. So we will go through several topics. I'll start with a bit of background about myself, although Professor Hassak has shared that already. I'll talk about some of my research buckets, and then we'll delve into the project itself. So as Professor Hassak said, I'm currently an associate professor in the Structural Engineering and Construction Management Department. I got my PhD here from Purdue in 2016 with Professor Hassak, and I have been back in Cairo now for quite a while. I've worked in several research areas. I would say my main are these 5 plus contemporary topics. So I work mainly in interactional analysis connected to project delivery methods. I work on lean construction, specifically for real-life construction projects in Egypt. I've done AI applications in construction and also recently digital twin. So today we're going to be talking about the project, which has been going on for almost 2 years. We've received a 3-month extension, so it should be finishing up quite soon by the end of the year. So since it's been going on for a while, I'll be able to share a lot about the results that we have so far and the framework that we have. And we have several objectives from it. So what started out initially as us trying to understand the renewable energy PPP market in Egypt led us to look at first PPP projects on a global scale with a focus on renewable energy. And then we decided to go back into Egypt. And the main reason is that there are a lot of projects in Egypt, but there's a bit of a lack of data. So it's been a challenge trying to find real life data, although we've reached some, but we've had to look at data at a global scale first. So the first thing that we were going to do is identify the different PPP models, because there are many, and we found that renewable energy products are different from other types of infrastructure. Second was try to understand and map out projects in Egypt, look at a value for money analysis. Now we'll get into what that actually means, model risks and uncertainties in the VFM analysis, and finally create a framework to be followed by the ministries in Egypt. So this was for the Science and Technology Development Fund in Egypt, which is a governmental agency. So our project aims to help them. And that was because we found that in a lot of the times, first, there's no data available. Second, every single person owns part of the data, but no one has the entire framework. So for example, we went and we had meetings with the PPP Central Unit, and we found that although they are supposed to oversee all of PPP projects in Egypt, that doesn't happen. And one of the reasons for that was that the ministries actually have bylaws that enable them to procure, I want to say PPP-like ventures, because in order for it to be officially a PPP, the Ministry of Finance has to be involved. But there are cases where the Ministry of Finance isn't involved. So they label it as a PPP-like initiative, but they can't say it's a PPP. So this caused a bit of confusion because there are a lot of projects delivered in the same way, but they don't all fall under the same umbrella. So we've had to look at data from a lot of sources, and I'll share some of this data that we have. So the entire project falls into three main phases. First is a literature review, where we looked at PPP projects in Egypt, and we looked at them on a global scale. The second was a questionnaire survey, which we sent to experts all over the world. And the reason was that we found in a lot of the times, these experts don't work on just one country because they're all international experts. You know, some of them are based in South America, some of them are based in Asia, in Europe. And a lot of the times, since these projects are large scale and they involve so many parties, so you have international experts and you have international companies. So these people work on multiple projects. So we thought, why not get their experience in all of these projects, not just the Egyptian ones? And finally, the step which we're at right now is creating the value for money analysis. So we've reached the framework, but we're still looking into applying this framework and doing the validation. So next up, we'll talk about PPP from a governance perspective. We'll talk about how do we choose models? And in order to do that, we have to discuss the financial aspect part. So I'll talk about statistical analysis that we've done on these projects, as well as the financial analysis. But first, why are we looking at renewable energy? So why not look at any type of infrastructure? Why not look at the educational sector? And the reason was that we found two things. First is that these projects have been increasing throughout the years. So we can see here that the global solar PV generation in 2000, it was 1.5 gigawatt. It jumped to 71 gigawatt in 2011, jumped to 106 in 2013, and this was just 10 years ago. And this was the last reported global generation. And the second reason was that we found that there had been a lot of discussion on PPP projects for transportation projects, but it was very sparse in this area, and especially in Egypt. So with the PPP Central Unit, they currently have one project that's under review, and that's the first one that they get. Although the first reported project, PPP project, that was in the renewable energy was over 20 years ago. But like I said, the loophole is that there are certain ministries that can go through the PPP-like scheme. And just to give you a clear example, the main difference between going through the PPP Central Unit and not going through it is just one reason. So if you go the traditional route, which is supposed to happen the official way through the PPP Central Unit, that means that the Ministry of Finance will be involved. That means that they have to review all the documents. And that also means that they have to give certain okays and they have to give certain guarantees to the private sector. And these guarantees mean that in case the public or the government can't pay at any point in time, we, the Ministry of Finance, are going to cover all of it. Don't worry. So they're called sovereign guarantees. But what ended up happening to speed the process, because bureaucracy takes a long time. So what happens is that the private entity goes straight to any public sector and they tell them, let's do the PPP-like scheme. So we get the same benefits of it, but we just don't get the sovereign guarantee. But a lot of the times, the private sector is already making a lot of money, so they don't really care about this part. So this leads us to the governance perspective. Now, The problem with these projects is that they're highly capital intensive. We need a lot of money and they have a long operating life. So in order to do a PPP, usually the minimum duration we see is 20 years. And by 20 years, we mean a public entity signing with a private entity for it to either build, operate, maintain, finance, can be all or part of these, for a duration of 20 to 100 years. So the problem that happens in this case is that there are a lot of changes that happen throughout this time. There are a lot of risks that happen. So we need to study it extensively. But since it's usually a long-term project, the government doesn't want to pay its own money. They want someone else to take care of it. So imagine I told you, hey, you have a land that belongs to you. I'm going to build a hotel on this land with my own money. And then I'm even going to give you part of the rent each month. Will you say no? Of course not. It's free money for you. So it's kind of the same idea. The private goes to the public and tells them, hey, you have this land. Let me build some solar panels on it. And this way I generate electricity. And then I can sell it to you for a reduced fare, or I can sell it directly to the people. And then whatever money I make, I'll give you a cut from it. So again, it's very common and it's very easy for the public to say yes. And that's what usually happens. So there are several elements in developing infrastructure projects. So we have here elements that go from different government entities to the private sector, to the life cycle of the project that we have to look at, to the financing of the project and technical and financial study. So all of this causes a lot of complication in it. So that's why these projects are very complicated and they require a lot of effort to be put. So why renewable energy projects specifically, or why energy? Why not look into transportation, or why did the private get into these projects? And the reason is that it's usually almost stable demand. We have a rising population and we have people who are based in certain cities in Egypt a lot of the time. So we know that demand is going to increase. It hasn't been affected, for example, by the pandemic or by inflation or by anything else, unlike other sectors. There are economies of scale. It's usually low in sensitivity to economic swings, and there are tax benefits. So when the government tells you, hey, you can take my land, I'll also give you other benefits, you don't have to pay certain taxes. And that incentivizes the private. So in general, there are a lot of delivery models. Traditionally, these projects would have to be done through the traditional procurement method, which is an EPC, or where we have, a certain designer that comes and designs, and then we have a contractor, then we have another operator. But what started happening was that there was an increase in the pressure for infrastructure development. So the government had to fulfill more projects for the people and maintain the current ones that they have. And of course, they have a limited budget. So they've had to use money from the private sector. So we can see here below, it says that we have usually 3 options for infrastructure financing. We have the first, which is a sovereign or public finance. This is the usual, like the US, where we have a state or we have a government that has its own money. And the start of the fiscal year, they start saying, well, we're going to put this amount into this project and this amount into the other one. But again, it's limited. So the second, and what's becoming more popular now, is the private finance, and this is associated with PPP. So I, as the government, would prefer if I don't pay for it at all. Of course, that doesn't always work. There are cases where the government chips in, but from what we've seen, it's usually around 20% of the total cost as a maximum. And the reason is that the government wants to make sure that the private is invested. So if I put a lot of money as a private, that means I'm invested in the project. I want this to work because I want to get my money back as soon as possible. So that's what we do. And the third is corporate finance, which isn't very common because it's more of private to private. So that would be certain types of projects we have, like desalination, but that's not our focus. So we see here that 2 things. First is that there are differences among the PPP project schemes. It's not just one size fits all. And then there are other types of projects. So let's say we're looking at this scale. we have a normal EPC, and then we have the design, build, operate, maintain, that's DBOM, and then we can add the finance aspect to it, and then it can be a full concession where they have to go through the entire scheme, the design, build, operate, maintain, everything. And then finally privatization, but that's usually not done. That's if the private owns the entire asset. So let's say that we are looking at this diagram. What do we choose in our project? Which one do we go with? Do we go with design build? Do we go with design build, operate, maintain? So what we're trying to answer here is, what do we do? Which one do we choose? And how exactly do we choose it? So what happens is that we need to understand the differences. And you'll see here the different schemes. So we have an EPC, which is the normal design and then build. And then we have an EPC plus finance. So that means it's still an EPC, but we're getting finance from a bank. So it's still debt owed by the government. Or we have the PPP scheme. Or we have another scheme that's called EPC plus finance plus operate and maintain. And the reason I bring that up because it's a bit unique and it's a bit strange. And what it refers to is that the government starts with saying, I want a normal EPC, so I'm going to find a private sector for it. So they find a designer and a contractor. And then they say, well, I want someone to finance it. So they look for that. And then they say, well, I want someone to operate and maintain it. So what ends up happening is they have 3 separate contracts that they manage. And at the end of the day, they're the ones losing, because if they would have done it as a PPP, they would have won a lot more. This way, they wouldn't be as invested in the project in terms of the money that they pay. But you see here something a bit unique. The main difference between these 4 schemes is in the last row, and that is in the risk. So if you see here, you'll see that in 3 of the types, the risk mainly goes to the government. So you see the triangle shifting there. But the only case where majority of the risks go to the private is the PPP. And that is the core reason why governments choose PPP. Because if we're looking at construction costs, if I, as the government, am doing the project or a private is doing it, they can be a bit close. If we're looking at the operating and maintenance, again, they can be a bit close, but main difference between them is the risk. And it's because the private usually is more experienced in these projects. They have more technological advancements, so they are more likely to do better in these projects, and they are also more likely to be able to bear these risks. And this is why we choose PPP. So let's talk about the financing part. So how does that work? And you'll see on the left, it says here there are 3 sources of financing. Now, the private, it's up to them to get all of the money. They have to bring in, and if you look at numbers, some projects can start for $6 billion and they can go all the way up. They are very, very capital intensive. So what usually happens is that we have multiple private sectors. So we have usually a contractor, and then we have an operator and someone who operates, and then we have different parties, and all of them come together. So each one puts in some of the money. So that's equity. So every company pays part of it. And then there's the other part, that's debt. What happens is that, well, maybe they have about 60% of the money with them, but they need a bit more. So they go to the banks and they ask for a loan. So that's another part. And then the third part, they're grants. And these grants are usually by large organizations like the World Bank, EBRD, and others. And what happens is that, especially in the renewable energy area, since, you know, it's the clean, sustainable form, what happens is that some of these institutions sometimes have funds specifically for these projects because they want to help, they want to encourage the green and sustainable initiatives. So sometimes they fund part of it. So you'll see that. And then these are used to cover all of the work, all the way from construction to debt service, operation, life cycle. And of course, if I'm the private concessionaire, I'm not just going to pay for it. I want my money back plus some more. I want to be able to make money. So this is the financing structure where we have the government, and with the government, we have a concessionaire, and the concessionaire is also called an SPV, or special purpose vehicle, and this is sort of the legal term. And what SPV means is that we have a contractor, we have an engineering firm, we have an operator who all come together. And they can't be just one firm because they're separate. So they all form an agreement and they become one person only for this project. And then we have the financing institution so they can deliver the infrastructure facility itself. So let's go back to the part where we have to choose between them. Now, we understand that what PPP means. We know that it's a long-term venture between a public entity and a private entity. We know the private entity consists of multiple parties, and that these projects usually go on anywhere from 20 years up to 100 years. But let's stress on one thing. Let's think of renewable energy projects. Do you think that these projects can go up to 100 years? No. There are two unique things actually about renewable energy PPPs. The first is that if you look at the projects, a lot of them usually have a lifetime of 20 to 30 years. And by lifetime, I mean lifetime of the actual physical components. So the solar PV panels, they're not going to be able to withstand, 50 or 100 years of all of the heat, and they have certain lifetime. So what ends up happening is that these projects are delivered as a design, build, operate, and then there's no transfer because they can't really transfer. So what happens is that the private takes a piece of land and then they build the solar panels, they build all the structures on it, they operate for 30 years, and after 30 years, they just up and go. There's nothing else left for them to transfer. So that's one unique part of it. Another thing is that, like we said, they usually go on from 20 to about 30 years. So how do we choose which way to go? PPP versus EPC? We have to look at the money. So how do we do that? We have to do a feasibility study. And this is a bit similar to the feasibility study we do for a normal construction project, but it's on steroids because this is a lot bigger. So what we would normally do is we have an owner that wants to do any project. I want to build a home for myself, or if I'm the government, I want to build any infrastructure. I would look at it, how much it would cost me. Is this sufficient? Do I have the money? Can I recoup the money over a period of time? Will this help the people? But imagine that this is not a 2 or 3 year project. This is something that can go on up to 100 years. So that means that I have to look at the entire cash flow of the 100 years. So for the feasibility study, what we do is we want to avoid certain problems. We want to avoid cost overrun. We want to avoid being delayed. We want to achieve something called value for money, which we will discuss. So we need to figure out what is the best method. So the feasibility study is very critical, especially in PPP, and it has a lot of long-term implications. Based on this feasibility study, we're going to make an investment decision. So there are several rounds of it. First, we want to figure out, are we, as the government, are we going to do this project or not? If we are we going to do it as an EPC or a PPP? If we're doing it as a PPP, that means that there's another layer. We have to do something called a value for money, which we'll discuss. So there are a lot of layers involved in this. And this was the main issue that we found, that a lot of the times, no one had the experience to do all of this. So what ended up happening was that the PPP central unit, for every project that they would have to contract with an international expert because they have a lot of expertise in this area. And then they would have to do it for every project. And another problem we faced in our project was that a lot of this data, if not all of it, belonged either to the expert or to the private concessionaire. So the government didn't have access to it afterwards. Because at the end of the day, if the private is going to work on a feasibility study for themselves, then they want to keep them in the numbers. They don't want anyone to know how much they're making. So this means that there are two ways, or there are two parts of it. There's the feasibility study that the private has to do, and then there's another one that the public has to do. And what the public has to do is called the value for money. So for me to study this, I want to know, well, should I do this project? What's going to come out of it? So I have to do one of two things or both. The first is a financial analysis, and the second is an economic analysis. Financial is very easy. It's crunching numbers. I want to know if I'm going to make money or not. And if I am, how much am I going to make? So I want to know the exact financial benefits. I want to know my exact cash flow. How much am I paying every single year? How much am I getting back? When's the payback period? So this is the financial analysis, straightforward calculations. The economic is a bit different. For some of these projects, it can be straightforward financial. We just want to see the numbers. But some of these projects, they actually have other benefits. Their benefits aren't just financial. So for example, let's say that we built a new toll road, and that toll road saves 45 minutes for the people every day in their commute. So this is a benefit they can't really quantify in terms of numbers and put it on the financial analysis. Or I provide a cleaner source of energy and something that can be sustainable. Again, this is not something I can put in numbers. So this is where the economic analysis comes in. And so we look at the social welfare here. So this is usually done in these projects. And a lot of the times, the decision to undertake a PPP project is not just financial. So it's not just because I'm going to make money or I'm going to be able to deliver an infrastructure without putting money. No, it's also for the people. So we have to sort of weigh both in. But for the value for money part, we look at only the financial analysis. We only look at the numbers. So this feasibility study contains a lot of parts. And if you've ever seen one for PPP projects, it's thousands of pages. It contains so many details, and just one number that is off can shift everything. So we go through the needs analysis, and this is all done by the government because they want to make sure, do we really want this project? Do we really need it right now? Are we committed to it? Do we have the resources for it? Well, what are our options? Can we do something differently? Because we can't just say we want X. And then we have to do the due diligence part. We have to look at the legal issues, the site ownership. And for the legal issues, actually, there were problems that happened in projects. So there was one project where there were several entities that came in. They were ready as a concessionaire. They wanted to start the project. There were negotiations with the government. And sometimes this happens, where the concessionaire goes, the government tells them, hey, I have an idea for a project right away. So they went to them, negotiations, contract was almost ready, it was almost going to be signed. This process took months and months of work. But at the end of the day, they could not agree on one thing, so the project never took off. And what they couldn't agree on was the arbitration clause, because the government wanted the arbitration to be in the country. They wanted to be something local. Well, it's our project, it's on our land, so we want that. But then the private sector was composed of multiple international organizations. So they said, nope, we're not doing that. We want something international. We want to be on neutral land in case something happens. They couldn't agree on it, so it never took off. So this is just one part of it, the due diligence. And then we have the financial assessment, which is the core of what we're going to be talking about. In the financial assessment, we want to know how much every single thing costs. But then there are risks involved and contingencies, so we need to calculate that as well. And then we need to do the full financial model containing all of the risks. So in order to conduct a feasibility analysis, we said we need to find out the factors that affect it. So what we did in this research is we looked at three main things. We looked at the barriers facing renewable energy PPPs, the key success factors, and we define that as factors that will make this project happen or will make it successful, and the key success indicators, which are post-contract, usually once the project is ongoing or operational. How do we say that this project is successful or not? And these results, you'll find them in about 4 of our papers, so I'll just share a snippet of it because of time. So for the barriers that face renewable energy projects, we found that according to literature, there were 10. There were regulatory barriers, political, revenue, technical, force majeure, financial, construction, operational, market, and technological. So this was based on extensive systematic literature review that we've done. We found that these were the 10 main ones, of course, with sub-components under them. And I told you in the beginning that we did a questionnaire survey, which we sent to experts worldwide. We wanted to know, since there was a bit of a lack of real data that we can analyze, so we thought, well, let's ask them about their expertise in these projects, because a lot of them said that we can tell you, but we can't share with you. So we went through the questionnaire survey, and then we decided to look at it from different lenses. We said, why not kind of classify all of these people into 3 different sectors? Because that's what we noticed. Some of them worked at private sectors, some worked at public institutions, and some were from academia. And then after we got the data, we found that a lot of these experts, they worked in different parts of the world. So sometimes they had projects in Latin America, and they had others in Southeast Asia and others in the Middle East. So we said, why not do a continental analysis? And finally, we said, well, we also have another classification. We can look at it from the lens of developing versus developed countries. So we did all of that. Well, I'll share with you just one snippet so we know, part of what we can do, and then I can share the rest of the work in our papers. So for example, for the barriers facing these projects, we can see here that we have 3 colors. We have color for the public, which is orange, private, which is gray, and then yellow for academia, and then we have an average. And then on the x-axis, it shows, the frequency depending on their answers. And on the y-axis, we have the probability and the importance of it. And then we have also the impact in another slide. And this is for every single one of the risks. So I want you to look at the graph below, which shows the probability of occurrence of every one of these barriers. And you'll notice something a bit funny. You'll see here, we notice that academia gives a really high probability for almost everything. We weren't sure why is that, so we did interviews with them afterward. And then you will find something else. You'll find that the public gave higher importance or higher probability to a lot of the risks. But the thing you'll have to know is that in most of these contracts, the public didn't actually bear any of these risks. They only bore the force majeure, and that was usually divided among both of them, public and private. And they were also responsible for the political and regulatory. So it was strange to us why they gave a very high probability for all of that, but it kind of explained why they went to PPP. So they really can't quantify these risks properly. They think that a lot of these have a very high impact, because if you look at the private, you'll see they're giving them much lower probabilities. So this was something we observed. And then we decided to draw a bit of a heat diagram so we can see what the highest of these barriers were. So for example, for the public, you'll find that the highest was regulatory, but that was common also for the private academia. But you'll see different ranking for all of these barriers. So this was the first part. And then we also looked at a continental analysis. So you'll see over here for the barriers. So you'll find, for example, that the dark blue or the navy blue seems to be the highest towards the middle, and that is Australia. So you'll find them giving a higher probability and impact. So the top one, again, is the probability of occurrence, and the bottom one is the impact. So you'll see that, in Australia, they give certain things high probabilities and impacts, and then it'll be followed by Europe, whereas the green is South America, they give it the lowest. And again, we delve into why this happens. We delve into the projects in our papers. And this is a heat map of the previous slide. And we thought, well, why not look at it in a different way? We want to see how each of these continents looks at the barriers. We want to see it, well, do they all look at them similarly in terms of ranking or not? And you'll find that for a lot of these risks, they do look at them similarly. So how we figure that out is if we look at, let's say, the first risk, you'll find that the first is regulatory risk, and that was ranked top by 5 out of the 7 of these continents. So if you look at another risk, let's say if you look at the yellow, which is the political, again, you'll find it in the top 2 or 3. But if you look at something like the light brown color, the taupe one, which is number 6 overall, you'll find that it fluctuates a lot. And that is a technological advancement. You'll find that for Africa and Asia, they rank it at 6, and then Europe, it's 5, and then it goes down in North America, to 7. It goes to the very bottom in South America. So they're saying this is the lowest barrier that we're seeing, and then goes back up. So there's a lot of fluctuation. So there are differences among them, but there are some similarities. A lot of them agree on the political and regulatory as the top barriers. We also looked at the key success indicators of these projects, and we found that there were 6 main key success indicators. They were value for money achieved, risk sharing mechanism, there were traditional KPIs like cost and time, the resources saved, reduction emission, and the produced energy capacity. So these were measures of success of the projects after they were constructed. And when you look at them, you'll also observe differences. So we have here the public versus private versus academia. And you'll find that academia gives a highest rank to the reduction in emissions and the produced energy capacity. This is what they care about. And this is what you also see in a lot of the papers that discuss these projects. Whereas for the private or the public, no, that's not it. We care about money. So you'll see that for the private, the highest rank they gave was for the value for money achieved. And for the public, they looked at resources saved. Are we saving money? All right, great. This is a successful project. So this kind of is in alignment with, the traditional views from each sector and with papers that we have. We did the same for the key success factors, but I won't share that here because of time. But let's get into the value for money. So how do we do? How do we quantify our calculations? How do we say as a government that we are going to do a PPP or we won't do a PPP? This is what we do. We conduct a value for money, which is a tool that is used to evaluate the project to make a decision. So what we need to do here is sort of make an apples to apples comparison. We need to say, if I were the government procuring this traditionally, how much would I pay for it? Well, I'm going to pay X. Okay, if I go through the PPP scheme, how much will I pay through it? And they have to make both comparisons in order to see which one is better. So the other route, which is figuring out how much we're going to pay if it were a PPP, we compare that with something called a public sector comparator, or a PSC. And this is the core of the VFM. This is what we do to figure out, well, how much will it cost us if we were going to do the PPP? And there are various reasons why we do the PPP. It was the VFM. We want to increase the efficiency, manage risks more, we want to look at innovation. So it leads to a lot of these things. But then how do we do it? We have 2 ways. We have the qualitative and the quantitative. The qualitative is basically just, we're sense checking. Hey, have we put all of the conditions here? Does this look good? Is there competitive tension? And that means, have we looked at multiple private entities or just one? Because if we're looking at just one, that's similar to like a direct bid. That basically means I'm giving him a free gift. Hey, put whatever number you have, I'll just sign the check. But we don't want that. And actually, a lot of the times we found that the private sector approached governments and told them that. And this led to a VFM not happening. Because again, going back to the hotel example, I come to you, tell you, I'm going to construct the hotel for you. I'll give it to you after 50 years and I'll give you some money. You're not going to say no. You're saving me resources. I'm not going to have to look into alternatives. I'm not going to have to, have like a public bid. No, all I do is I sign that check. So unfortunately, that happened a lot of the times. The second, which is the quantitative assessment. And over here, we compare the PPP option with the public sector comparative. So the public sector comparator is the number that I, as the government, would pay if I were procuring this as an EPC. So we have to compare it, but there's one thing to note. Remember in the start, we said there's one thing that's unique about PPPs, and that's why a lot of the governments go for them. That's the risk. So we need to look at that because, again, this could be a 100-year project. So what we have to do is we look at the risk-adjusted cost to the government, because we have to look at the risks over this period of time. So we first have to quantify these risks and figure out how much they are. But to be a bit more real on this, we don't do this just once. So what usually happens is that this public sector comparator and the VFM, they're done at least 2 times. At least once before the bidding process. This is before we even think of the project, and then during the bidding process. At first, it's more of, an overview or of value just to say, hey, PPP is a good option. And the second time is to compare it with the actual bids that we get. So it's usually more detailed by then. And of course, we have to look at, are we going to do a financial cost or an financial analysis or an economic analysis? And we usually want to do both. But depending on the government's priorities, we can only focus on one sometimes. So there are 3 parts that we have to do here. The first is we have to do the public sector comparator versus PPP. You get these numbers. But imagine a cash flow that we're looking at, which can be, let's say, 100 years. And we have all the numbers that are going to be paid every single year of them. Can we compare 2 different cash flows? We can't do that. So what we have to do is we have to compare just one number. So that's called the net present value. So we have to convert an entire cash flow of 100 years just to one number. I can't be looking at how much I'm spending every single one. I just want to compare, again, apples to apples. 1 billion versus 1.2. And this way I can know what's better. So this is the net present value, or NPV. We say at risk because we have to consider the risk involved. And then our output is something called the levelized cost of electricity, which is, part of the cost that we look at, because it says, what's the cost to the people? Because I want to know if I'm going to be able to recoup that money. So what does the PSC consist of? It consists of 4 different things. We have the transferred risk, the competitive neutrality, the direct costs, and the retained risk. You might be thinking, why do we have 2 parts for the risk? Why is it divided into 2? And the reason is that we said that the good thing about PPP is that the private is going to be able to bear a lot, if not all, of the risks. So what happens is that when we're looking at the PSC, the public sector comparator, the government is paying for everything, 100% of the cost. So they're paying for all direct costs and they're paying for all the risks. But when we compare it to a PPP, what the government will do is they're going to give away some of the risk to the private. They'll say, hey, you are going to be doing that. So that is a transferred risk. So the transferred risks are the risks that go to the private, and the retained are those that the government keeps because it's more equipped to bear them. And then there's something called competitive neutrality. And what that refers to is, in a lot of the cases, the government has a certain advantage because, it owns the land, it's exempt from taxes. So we have to add that in because we can't say that I'm the government, I'm going to be saving, let's say, $100 million, and then compare that to what the private would be paying and not include that benefit. So I have to, again, do apples to apples comparison, and that's why we do this. So the raw PSC, which is the first step that we do, and this is pre-risk. So this is all the numbers. It's the capital, the operating cost, the CapEx, OpEx that we have, and over the entire period of the project. So it's a cash flow forecast. We're looking at every single year, all the payments, all the revenues, all of that. And then, like we said, the competitive neutrality is all of the advantages that go to government just because it's the public sector, it owns the lands and all of that. The transferred risks, like we said, everything the government gives to the private. So if it's going to be a PPP, they're not going to do anything about it. The retained risks are those that it maintains. So this sums up the PSC versus PPP. On the left, we have the CapEx, all the capital expenditures. And then remember, if the government will do it, it will also have to pay for financing. It might pay from its own budget or get financing as well. Then we have O&M, operation and maintenance. We have annual index related to inflation and other factors. And then we have all of the risks. If you look at a PPP, we still have CapEx. We still have financing costs. We still have all of that. But the difference in VFM comes from what? It comes mainly from the risk, because the private is better equipped at handling it. So instead of, having a contingency of X, well, I as the private can do better. So I'm not going to be paying all of that for the risk. I'm going to be paying less. And of course, in some cases, if it has technological advantages, then the CapEx can also be less. So the construction cost can also be less. So we have to do a risk matrix that involves identifying all of the risks and assessing them, finding the probability and impact. And if you've ever looked at a risk matrix for a PPP project, you'll find that it's like a dissertation. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages of so many risks. And this is the part where they're bringing a lot of experts, because anything missed can cause problems for the entire project. And there were a lot of projects that actually had to be bailed out by the government, or the concessionaires they stopped work, and so many problems happened because of that. So this here shows the typical allocation for PPP projects, and you'll find that the only two risks where sometimes there is a bit of a talk between both actors is the demand risks and the force majeure. Sometimes they're shared, sometimes they go to one party, depending on the project. And the other risks, we know which ones the private handles and which ones the government handles. So what we have so far is an output of about 6 papers. We have 2 papers published in journal papers, 2 that are under review, and 2 conference papers. And we have 1 journal paper that we're working on. And these have different topics, so I'll tie that in with what we said earlier. The first project, we look at renewable energy PPPs, specifically in Egypt. So we wanted to look at the perception of the barriers and the key success factors, and we did that, by sector. And the second, we looked at the barriers and key factors and then key success indicators, but more of a continental analysis. We wanted to delve into why does this happen? And it was easy at times to find data from different sources online. We currently have another one under review that's specifically for developing and developed countries, because we found that, although it's difficult to look at 2 sets of the world as either developing and developed, or look at, the continents and say that, hey, we have general ideas of what they are. But at the end of the day, the location or the socioeconomic status of a country does have its impact. And we found that a lot of the times there were similarities between them. And we have also several research papers, conference papers that you can look at, which look at, again, the same ideas. And the last thing I want to say is, going back to this VFM, although we have certain ideas of how it should be done, a lot of the times they're either not done. So the government decides, I'm not going to put an effort into doing this. And what it does is it hires international experts to review the feasibility study that's done by the private. They say, well, they've done their work, they're going to be bearing it. But there has been a bit of a shift recently into having more of the work done through the PPP Central Unit. So we've been working with them. We've been trying to help them create that framework. So we have the beginning ideas of the framework. We have the exact numbers. We have the equations. We've done that in a case study. We're at a part where we want them to do sort of the final review to verify that, this can be correct, and then it'll be published. Some of the data we can't share, but we'll be able to discuss the results. So this is where we're at right now, like the last stretch of it. So I know I've taken up a bit more of your time, so I will leave it at that. And I will share my email here. If any of our online participants have any questions, I'd love to hear from everyone. I'll open the floor to questions from the audience here, and thank you all for your time.
So for questions in the room, just so for everyone to be able to hear, sorry to interrupt, there are microphones on your desk. So if you push, there's a button to push and you'll see a green light pop up. Just so everybody online can hear, and I've unmuted the Zoom people so they can ask.
Thank you. Well, we have time for questions. So, anybody? Well, I have a question. Let me get it started while you are thinking about what you asked. So you mentioned about a lot
I don't know.
of risk in
Yeah, go ahead and turn on that.
yeah, there you go. Well, sorry about that. So you mentioned about a lot of risk in PPP projects, and earlier in your presentation you had mentioned about the sovereign guarantee that in Egypt has been removed now on many of the projects. I was wondering what type of how has it impacted more PPP type projects coming up, or private entities jumping into taking on that additional risk?
That's a great question. So in order to have more of these PPPs and have them quicker, there have been the untraditional routes where we don't have to go through the Ministry of Finance, so there's no sovereign debt. So that means that there are a lot of these projects. The problem is that since they're not exactly labeled as PPPs, you won't find them in any of the databases. So there's a bit of a problem because now we need to classify, well, what constitutes a PPP? Are these PPPs or not? So they are in structure, but then they're not available anywhere. So to answer your question, that has led to a lot more PPP projects. We've seen a lot in the renewable energy sector. So we have a project called Bimban, which is like a solar field, and that's in Upper Egypt. It's a large scale project. And, they've had projects going on from about 1998, and there have been lots of PPPs over there. So it is still increasing, and it's increasing in all of the sectors, not just this sector. But we're seeing a bit more shift towards the PPP central unit handling more of these projects.
Thank you. Anybody else? Questions?
Yeah, go ahead. Can you? Hey.
Yes. So the presentation, it was really amazing. I was looking at the sort of like the flow diagram you showed with regards to the risks ranking for PPPs for renewable energies for different continents. And then I was looking at one of the risks that probably affect some other continents as well. For example, some renewable energy at some point they are in use, and all of a sudden probably the government says that, okay, there's another possible renewable energy, and they just shut that down. And then that could also be a risk that affects this kind of project. So I don't know if that could also like have a way, because I was looking into probably it could fall under maintenance or operation or something. But sometimes because they find a newer renewable energy that produces more of energy, kind of just decommission the ones they have existing. So is there like a way to like look into that as some of the risks to be faced?
That's a good question. So about other types of renewable energy, we do have some wind farms, but I believe we have only maybe 1 or 2 projects. Our focus is still on solar energy. You'll find a lot of projects. And the reason is that we have a lot of land. We have a lot of land that's just empty. And we usually have like high temperatures, and we have, solar energy actually from the sun coming in a lot of the day of the year. So that's been something that we've been trying to capture. So that's the reason why, this has been the main source so far. But yeah, I think towards the future, of course, there might be a shift a bit towards other sources once they do come up. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
I found it interesting in your analysis of the risks, and wondered, have you thought about why South America finds the technology risk virtually non-existent compared to all the other continents? that exist, because normally at a technological institution, we think of technology as being the same everywhere.
Thank you for that question. So in terms of technological advancements, there have been some, but there haven't been that many in like the solar energy area. And I have a student who's currently looking more into the continental analysis part, because some of it, was really jarring to see why certain continents would focus on certain ones. But for example, when we started another project, we have a proposal that's going on also related to energy efficiency. We found that in Egypt, it was going to be a bit difficult to, first of all, we can buy solar panels, we can buy things from Egypt, but there are things that would be difficult to import. There were things that would take a lot of time, or we won't be able to import it as a university. So this is something that we are going to look at, whether, there are certain rules and regulations that apply to these sectors in other countries that affect maybe the technological aspect of things, especially that some of these entities are the private sector, not in all cases, they are international organizations, so they want to bring in their own technologies. And one more thing is that a lot of the concessionaires were composed of not a lot, but some of them are composed of Latin American parties. So I think this is one of the reasons why, they have a lot of experience. Maybe they've been doing it for a while. Yeah.
Let me see if we have questions on the online participants.
Hi, this is Deepak Benny. I'm not able to check my video, but I'll ask a question directly. Okay, so when we do a value for money analysis, do you think typically we should consider the revenue lost for the government, let's say the direct revenue losses? Let's say, for example, in case of solar PPPs, there is a cost of electricity revenue that gets transferred to the private sector when a VFM analysis is done, or when a PPP is engaged in the private sector. So this loss of revenue, should it be considered in a VFM analysis, or we just compare the CapEx part, or is it absorbed in the financial cost or things like that? Do you have any experience with that?
That's a great question. So in terms of revenue loss, because, we now have a private entity that is operating a solar project, and that means that, instead of the traditional electricity route, then that means that there will be revenue lost. That is not calculated in the VFM. What the VFM does is that we're looking at a new project to build, and we usually are thinking we're going to build it anyway. So should we do this as a PPP, or should we do this in the normal EPC route? So it doesn't look at, if there is revenue lost from other existing projects. What it looks at is just for a new one, because a new one here that I'm going to build it, I'm going to be able to make revenue from it. So what is the better route for it? So that's how it's usually done.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from online audience? Please go ahead and unmute and well, while people are thinking about questions, do we have any questions here? I cannot see. Yes, go ahead.
Well, thank you for the presentation. So I was wondering how much does achieving sustainable development goals defined by the Paris Agreement influences defining infrastructure projects to be financed through PPP?
Oh, can you say, so you're talking about how do we sort of rank the different projects according to the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes, that's
okay. I got it. Thank you, Ali. So there's been a bit of a shift because, of course, you've heard of the UN's goals for sustainable development. So there's been a bit of a shift recently towards more sustainable projects. But what we've noticed in a lot of the renewable energy cases that they don't come from the government. So what happens is that a private sector approaches the government and says, hey, you have a piece of land here, and this is usually in Aswan, Upper Egypt. can we take part of that? And here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a solar panel. We're going to operate this in a certain way for 30 years, and then we'll leave the land to you. So it hasn't come from the government where there's, you know, there's now a certain vision that they're trying to solve. But because a lot of the time it comes straight from the private, that means that, you know, I don't really need to look at these rankings, but there is a goal for it. I don't have the numbers right now, but yeah, it's there. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to know what did you do to like perform or do the continental analysis thing? How did you get the results from that? And what did you do to like get those results?
Okay, thank you for the question. So for the continental analysis, what we did was send a questionnaire survey to experts all over the world. So we have about 60 something experts, and each one has worked on at least 3 projects and go up to tens of projects depending on their experience. They all have about 15 plus years of experience. So we had an extensive survey where we asked them, first step was, you know, what are the risks that you see in the projects? What are the barriers? And then we had done an analysis of all of the barriers. And then we asked them to sort of rank them according to their importance, according to their probability, impact. And then there were questions that were not discussed here, but they were related to their view of each of the sectors. So their view on the public and how they handle risks, and their view on the private and how they handle risks. And then they were asked also about value for money, whether they've conducted that or whether that's conducted in their projects. So there were extensive, you know, questions. And for the results that we see here, since a lot of it was ranking, so we did some statistical analysis on it in order to do like the continental analysis part and see what each sets of experts think depending on the continent that they've worked on. Thank you for your question.
Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. So you told the journal that is up, the papers that is still under review, that is for developing versus developed countries. On what basis are you classifying the countries? Because according to the UN data, there's also another category for emerging economies, or so how are you classifying it? And it varies from year to year as well. So
yes, it varies. So we used last year's data according to the World Bank's definition of what developed countries were and what developing countries were.
When talking about the PPE, you mentioned like they are involved in building, operating, and maintaining. Does they also involve in once they are done, like what do you say, the word for like e-waste, all the solar waste, to deal with those waste? And the next will be, as countries are coming up with their emission-free deadlines, like zero emission by 2060 or something, does it overrides their own policy in terms of giving more priority to the renewable energy?
So for the first part you addressed, that's an interesting take on it. We haven't looked at the waste after. So what we know is that after the project is done, after they're, let's say 25 or 30 years, they're done, the private takes whatever they have, they up and go, but we haven't looked at the waste part. I think we'll have to look into that and see whether they dispose of the waste somehow, or if there's anything left to be sold, or what happens. That's a good one. Thank you. And what was the second one? Remind me.
Does the countries override their own personal policies in terms of achieving the emission-free deadlines for them?
I haven't looked at the environmental aspect of this in terms of the PPP projects. We were focused mainly on the financial and the economic analysis, but I think it would be interesting to see what the environmentalists say about this. But thank you for the suggestion.
So we have one question coming in from the online audience. Professor Abraham has a question. Dulce, would you like to just open your mic and ask the question?
Okay, so my question was, how do a country's regulations and energy agreements impact the qualitative as well as the quantitative, economic as well as financial analysis?
How do the regulations affect those sets of analysis that are done?
Yes. so the weights that are given to different factors and so on.
Oh, I see. So you'll find that in the results that we have, in a lot of the cases, the highest barriers were the regulatory and political. And in a lot of the cases, when we focused on Egypt, what happened was that some of them, they did actually do a value for money analysis. In other cases, they didn't. But what we found that the focus was mainly on the quantitative part, because at the end of the day, they want to be able to crunch numbers. And it's usually one committee reporting to, someone higher up and telling them, hey, we're going to do this because it saves X. So the focus has been mainly on the quantitative part. The qualitative is usually part of the pre-qualification when they're looking at bids. And that answers the question.
Okay, great. I think we have one more question from the online audience. Suyash, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Oh, thanks for the presentation, Dr. Khallaf. My question was, has China been active in Egypt with its Belt and Road Initiative? And can such projects be also labeled as PPP projects? That was the first part.
Can what be, or what has been done in Egypt? I didn't catch the first part.
Oh, has China been active in Egypt with its Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road Initiative?
Has China been active in Egypt? Well, they've been active in the construction sector. We've seen a lot of that. I'm not sure about PPPs in specific, because a lot of the times China has been involved in the construction of projects like the railroad, the new administrative capital. We have a lot of new construction there. So you've seen Chinese contractors, but we'll have to look at the PPPs as well. A lot of the times, and this is worldwide, we've seen different parties come in. We've seen like Spanish, Australian, we've seen different concessionaires from all over. So they could be involved in some. Thank you for the question.
Well, I think we have exceeded our time. Quite a bit, and there are a lot more questions coming in. So let me take the privilege of asking the last question. And that is that, you were talking about arbitration, and you mentioned about, we have also heard that PPP projects get into litigation often because of a lot of risk factors. So picking up on the international study that you did, was there any indicators of which country there was more litigation and because of, laws, regulations, or whatever?
So there were a lot of studies. This is a great question. I could go on for hours about it. But there were a lot of studies focusing on this. And one of the people that had done a lot of the studies was someone called Louis Gouache, who worked at the World Bank and also was affiliated with universities. And he found a lot of renegotiations, especially in Latin America and South America. Sometimes it would go up to something like 3 renegotiations per project. What happened a lot of these times was, we said that sometimes the private will go straight to the government. So when they would go, they would be the sole bidder. So that means that, they already have their numbers up. They've already crunched everything. Other cases where there were multiple bidders, well, the concessionaire wants to win. So they would try to, see how they can do that. So they'd be a bit more opportunistic in saying, well, I am going to put my numbers at this, but then I'm going to renegotiate after a while. So they already have a plan to renegotiate. So there were instances where, we've seen that. There were instances where the government had to bail in a project and pay money. So we'd see the main, I'd say, consequence of renegotiation in the government having to pay to the concessionaire. So in the beginning, the concessionaire would come in saying, I'm financing this 100%. You don't need to pay. Or you can pay, and it was usually up to 20% of the total amount. And then after several negotiations, you'd find that the government is paying almost 80% of the cost. So now, why are we doing a PPP if I'm paying all this? But by then, the project would already be underway. We'd be 10, 20, 30 years in. And they'd be paying it bit by bit. So we've also seen that happen. It wouldn't be 80% at once, but it would be, 10% this time, and then 15 another time. And then by the end, oh, wow, we paid all of this. And since it's over a period of 100 years, so we don't have the same officials. So what happens is, the first government officials that are in office, they come out and say, hey, we've signed a new project that's going to benefit you. We've done all of this great work and people are happy. And then next officials who are in office, oh, wow, we need to bail this out a bit. And then next time, so this is another problem, you know? And in some of the cases also, we've seen that the first officials who signed the project, they only care about coming out and saying that we have something. So they haven't done like an extensive analysis. So that's what ends up happening, that we need to bail them out. So this is sort of, to sum up, part of what renegotiation does.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we have run out of time. So, yeah, sorry. I think we have run out of time. I know there are more questions. It's a very interesting topic. But please give Professor Khallaf a big round of applause. So thank you for kickstarting the seminar series for this semester. And please look forward to many more of interesting seminars. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us in person and online, and see you another time.
Thank you.
Thank you.